When we're making sense of the world around us, what we're really doing is comparing some representation of the world as it is, as we understand it to be, with a representation of how we would like the world to be, or some aspect of the world to be. And it's that difference between the way the world seems to us and the way we really want it to be that creates a gap that motivates an emotional response.
Welcome to the Dealing with Feelings webcast. Today, I had the pleasure to speak with Dr. James Gross, professor at Stanford University and one of the world's leading scientists in emotion regulation. We spoke about the science and practice of one of the most research-based strategies for dealing with your feelings. It's called cognitive reappraisal. We talked about what it is and how to apply it. I really love getting into the weeds with James, and I hope you will too. It was a great conversation. Enjoy. So James, of course, I'm going to start off with the question that I ask everyone, which is, how are you feeling?
Excited. Energized.
Excited. Great. Energized. That's awesome. As you know, this series is about healthy emotion regulation. And I think that, when I go around talking with people about it, most people say, oh yeah, that's about fixing your feelings. It's about controlling your feelings. People don't really understand the concept. And so I want everyone to hear from you how you define emotion regulation.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. I think it's great to start with the basics, right? So when we think of emotion regulation, I think we too often have the sense that this is all about swatting away negative emotions and sometimes increasing positive emotions. And that's not entirely wrong. I mean, that is important to do. But I think from my perspective, emotion regulation is a lot more than that. Emotion regulation has to do with detecting and understanding the emotions that we have, and then coming to some sort of clarity about whether those emotions that we're having are helpful to us or unhelpful to us in a particular context. And so for me, emotion regulation has to do with a full set of processes that underlie our ability to appreciate the emotion we're having and then make decisions about whether that emotion is helpful or harmful in a particular context. And if we judge it to be harmful for whatever reason, in that it gets in the way of some of the goals we have, we might then avail ourselves of one or more strategies to influence that emotion. And that can take the form of decreasing how we feel, but it can also take the form of increasing how we feel or targeting other aspects of emotion, like the behavior or the physiological responses that make up the emotion. So for me, emotion regulation, as you say, is a very general suite of processes that allows us not just to swat away emotions, but to appreciate our emotions and see that they're often incredibly helpful. But when they're not, it allows us to do something about those unhelpful emotions.
Thank you. Given, where the world is at these days, there's so much going on that, people talk about, well, what are your coping strategies? How are you dealing with your negative moods? Is there any nuance there that you think is important for people to know in terms of the differences between, let's say, emotion regulation and mood regulation and coping?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from my perspective, when we talk about emotion regulation, we are, in fact, focusing on just one of many types of affect. So for me, the superordinate term when we think about these hot states like moods and stress responses and emotions is this term affect. And for me, that's just something that functions to alert us to things that are potentially good or potentially bad, either in the world around us or in our own bodies. So these affective responses, these good, bad responses, can take a lot of different forms. One form is emotion, with its characteristic pattern of changes in how we feel and behave and respond physiologically. But there are other types of affective responses, and you've named a few of them: moods, stress responses, other kinds of appetitive and defensive impulses. And those each have their own kind of rules of operation, so that there's slight differences that are sometimes important and sometimes not important when thinking about the difference, let's say, in regulating emotions versus regulating moods or regulating stress responses or regulating other impulses. So our focus has been emotion regulation. But honestly, what we're finding in general is that many of the things that seem to be true about emotions and emotion regulation are also pretty true about some of the other affective states. So even though we're trying to be pretty specific, I don't mind at all when people generalize from what we learn about emotion regulation to regulating other affective states. And some of our work, in fact, we try to generalize theoretically and empirically to these other states. So I'm pretty comfortable with people using the term very generously when we talk about emotion regulation.
I think it makes sense because so many of the strategies like, exercise, is one global, like large strategy. Like you can, work off some stress. You can, if you're in a funky mood, you can go work out. If you're grieving someone, it might be a good distraction or helpful strategy. Now, of course, people ask me, and I'm sure you've gotten this question before, in my work, on emotion, regulation, emotional intelligence, people are always like, why are you so passionate about this? Why are you running around the world trying to get people to talk about their feelings all the time? And like, where did that motivation come from? And so I'm really curious, as a scientist in this space who has, just been so prolific, when was the aha for you in terms of, I'm going to study emotion regulation?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mark. And we share that passion, which I'm delighted is true. And I think for me, the origins of that probably came just as I was beginning graduate school. I was fortunate enough, I majored in philosophy as an undergraduate and knew that I was interested in the intersection between reason and the passions, as they're called in philosophy. But I didn't quite know what form that should take. And so when I started graduate school, working with an outstanding advisor, Bob Levinson, I was lucky enough to be a participant in a training program, the world's first training program in affective science. And although it was a postdoc program that was being run at the time by Dick Lazarus and Paul Ekman, they allowed a few graduate students to sit in. So I was invited as a first-year graduate student to sit in on this training program in affective science that was really meant to train postdocs, but I got to sit in throughout my time as a graduate student. And as I sat in and thought about affective processes and the important role they played, not just in humans, but in non-humans as well, the ways that they helped and sometimes got in the way, I got really interested in the ways that we as humans can regulate or influence these affective states. And it was at that moment, I think, early in graduate school that I thought, this is it. This is the career that I want to have. And the reason I think I had that experience is that I knew from philosophy that this is one of the oldest questions there is in the Western tradition. This question of, are we essentially rational? Are we essentially passionate? Or are we both? And if we're both, how do we deal with the fact that we get moved to act both by what we think and by what we feel? How does that work? And when it doesn't work very well, what do? How do we manage this sort of situation where we've got these multiple drivers? It's as though you've got 4 or 5 people packed into the front seat trying to drive a car. That can go well, but when it doesn't go well, what do? And so I was very interested in this and knew that this was a deep and rich problem. And what I learned as a graduate student was that this wasn't just a philosophical problem. It was a problem that we could engage with experimental methods. And so building on work that had been done before, I started out in my first year trying to understand the effects of particular forms of regulation on emotional responding. And some people's careers are desperately interesting. They do 8 or 10 things before breakfast every day, all quite different. My career is not like that. I've locked onto a problem I really care about, that I'm deeply passionate about. And from the first moment in graduate school through to today, that's the problem I'm engaged with. So that's sort of the history of it, Mark.
So going into now we're going to get granular. Of course, I know your work well. It's been an inspiration in my whole career. you're most well known for studying a particular form of emotion regulation, reappraisal, or sometimes called reframing. Can you elaborate on that for us? Like, why'd you pick that strategy, and why is that strategy so important to know about?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for your kind words. And from my perspective, the work that I'll share a little bit about now is work that certainly didn't come from nowhere. This is work that builds on prior work by many, many people in the field. And I think it builds most importantly on a very fundamental insight, which again goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's the idea that although it sometimes seems to us that the way that we feel and think and behave is just the result of the situation we're in. So that the situation, someone saying something negative to us, for example, just forces us to have certain emotional responses. I think from time immemorial, people have appreciated a really important point, which is that it's not actually the world that directly impinges on us. It's the world as mediated by our thought processes. So most of the time when we have affective responses, those are the result not just of our situation, external situation, but by the way that we represent or interpret or understand or evaluate that situation. So that's an age-old insight. And Dick Lazarus in the early 1960s, using a stress and coping perspective, did some of the very first experimental work, as you know, where he brought people in and then he showed them upsetting film clips and tried to get them to use certain kinds of defensive responses, by which he just meant ways of thinking about what they saw. In that pioneering work, he established that you can actually shift some aspects of emotional responding by the way you think. And that's why I thought that this would be the philosophical background and this early empirical work together led me to think, wow, that's got to be an interesting thing to kind of push on further. It's very congruent, of course, with some of the work in cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, as you know. So there are a lot of reasons to say, yeah, let's understand this a bit better. But the core insight is a deep one that has to do with the fact that our experiences of the world are mediated by the way that we represent or think about the world around us. And the reason that's so important is that if we're suffering, as many people are, particularly today, that suffering can be fixed or addressed by changing the external world, but sometimes that's very difficult. So one of the other ways we can address that suffering is by changing the way people think and giving them more agency in terms of how they represent the world around them. That's why I think that was the starting point I chose.
Awesome. Now let's get really specific. So reappraisal, reframing. Can you explain what it is specifically and even give, some examples of different forms of reappraisals?
Basic idea then for reappraisal. And the reappraisal term comes from Dick Lazarus and his early work in stress and coping in the 60s. And the idea was that there's an appraisal process that automatically happens, a way that we typically evaluate a situation. And so the re part of reappraisal is just that we're going to now try to change that way of thinking so that we change the affective response. And the way I'm thinking about it, and colleagues and students of mine prefer to think about it, is that when we're making sense of the world around us, what we're really doing is comparing some representation of the world as it is, as we understand it to be, with a representation of how we would like the world to be, or some aspect of the world to be. And it's that difference between the way the world seems to us and the way we really want it to be that creates a gap that motivates an emotional response. And the emotional response is designed in part to try to narrow that gap. So concretely, if I'm going about my business, everyday life in the office, and someone's just seems really kind of negative towards me, says things that seem unappreciative and sort of toxic, what's happening as I start to feel an emotional response? I think one way of representing that is that I have a representation of how the world is. This person's sort of raining on my parade, and I certainly don't want the world to be that way. I want to have harmonious relationships with my colleagues. And so there's that discrepancy. And so my feelings of annoyance or irritation are occasioned by that gap between the way the world is or seems to me and the way that I'd like it to be. And that's what's generating my irritation and anger. So if I want to change that emotion using thinking, so reappraisal, there are two things I can target. One thing I can target is my representation of the way the world is. That's called Reconstrual. So I can think differently about, is it really the case that they're directing hostility to me, or are they kind of more generally in a bad mood? And is it everyone who's being negative to me, or is it just this one person who's having a bad day? And that can adjust my, oh my gosh, my work life is over feeling to being a much sort of more manageable state of affairs where one person seems to be having a generically bad day. So that's called, Reconstrual. And it's one type of reappraisal. The other target for reappraisal is not the representation of the way the world is, but the representation of how the world should be or how I'd like it to be. Because after all, it's that discrepancy between the two that's generating the emotion. So if I want to change the emotion, either change this guy or this guy. And that other one, as a target for reappraisal, is called repurposing. And repurposing just says, what are my goals in this situation? What is it that I really find important about the way the world should be? And I might, in this instance, say, look, I've been focused on them being negative to me, but let's focus on how I want to be with them, right? So let's start with me. And I might say, even though they're raining a little bit on my parade, that doesn't affect my goals. And my goals now are not to just sit here and bask in the sunshine, but rather to be compassionate towards this other person who's suffering. And all of a sudden I have a different goal. So now there's not that same huge discrepancy because I now have something I can do that I value, which is to try to be compassionate to somebody else. So that's from a theoretical perspective, sort of two big buckets that we can put reappraisal into. One is about changing the representation of the world. The other is changing sort of the goal that we have in a situation. And if you change either or both, we now know that you really can have a substantial impact on the emotional response.
And I can imagine that they work better for certain situations and certain emotions.
And I think more generally, Mark, it's helpful to imagine that some situations, taking a step back, are just more friendly to reappraisal efforts than others. If there's just something really awful that's happened, that's just sort of, there's not a silver lining. There's not a good way to think about just really sad thing that's just happened to you. In the moment, at least, it might be very difficult for even, a philosophical sage to find the right reappraisal because it's just not a situation that's conducive to that. But I think most of where we live and most of the times we have emotions, we're in situations that have some degree of affordance. That is to say, some degree of sort of ability to kind of maneuver by using reappraisal. And it's those situations that I particularly care about. But we've done studies of reappraisal affordance, finding that, we can characterize the kinds of situations that are more or less amenable to reappraisal. And then your question's a great one, which builds on that, which is, okay, in addition to being amenable to reappraisal in general, are there some situations that are amenable to reappraisal, but are probably better handled with repurposing or reconstrual? And that's actually a kind of a cutting edge point in the field. That's something we and others are working on, trying to figure out when is it better to use one versus the other. One big study we recently did on this, we looked at over 20,000 people during the pandemic. This was across over 80 regions and countries around the world. And we used a very simple reappraisal intervention that had both of these two components. So one version that people might be randomly assigned to get is repurposing, another reconstrual. And then we had two kinds of control conditions, an active control condition, and then a kind of do nothing condition. And in this study, we presented people with COVID-related imagery and asked them to use whatever strategy we gave them to manage their responses. And what we found is that both of the reappraisal interventions, the repurposing and Reconstrual, led to decreased negative emotion and increased positive emotion compared to the other two control conditions. And that we saw that in a number of different measures. So in that case, at least, we saw that both of these two forms of reappraisal looked pretty equivalent. So there weren't big differences in this general context. But I would imagine that in some specific contexts, you'd see some specificity so that there are places where you might be able to adjust your goal a little bit more easily than your representation of the world, and vice versa. You might think, no, I've got my goal. I don't want to change that, but I can change my representation of how the world seems to me.
Yeah. I mean, these are complicated concepts. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, gosh, this is pretty, high level in terms of the way we think about dealing with our feelings. I wonder if we can try to make this super practical for people. I'm going to give you my own I'll give you an example. So, recently, I've been talking with high schoolers, and, they're saying things like, I can't take it anymore, between the school shootings, between the wars that are happening, between, all the violence in our society and climate change. And I just can't take it anymore. And I'm wondering from the perspective of, reappraisal, like, how do we help a student who is ruminating, perseverating, venting endlessly, like about the things they're worried about, apply the strategy?
So there are two kinds of things that we might do here to think about the application. One is a little more sophisticated than the other, and I'll start with that a little bit more sophisticated kind of approach, and then we'll go to some practical kind of details. So the sophisticated version of a response would be to say, look, when thinking about a student who's saying, look, I just can't take it. I'm just like stressed out. The wars, there's school shootings, there's, all this grade stuff. There's like, there's social challenges. There's just like, one thing we can do is to appreciate that the negative state of stress and anxiety that they're experiencing is actually the result of several different factors. So one factor is that they're having these negative emotions because they're thinking about the world in the ways we've just been talking about, very different from what they would hope they would be. And that's generating a lot of angst and upset. But another thing that's true is that because we're people and have the capacity to represent our own emotional and cognitive processes, something called metacognition, because we can kind of step up a level and think, wow, here I am having all these stress responses. That second level, the feelings about feelings, is a place where a lot of our negativity gets generated. The reason that's relevant here is that as a high schooler experiences all of these feelings of upset, they may be looking out at others and looking at social media, and that suggests that no one else has the kind of struggle that they have right now. So one of the first moves I think I would want to make here is to normalize the stress response. And the way the reason that's helpful is that they not only are upset about the world, they're upset about being upset about the world. So one thing we can do, even without fixing the world or getting into the weeds about reappraisal about the world, is to have them reappraise their emotions about their emotions, which sounds a little paradoxical, but it's like part of what they're stressed about is the fact that they're stressed. And so if we can say, hey, everybody is finding this stressful, they can kind of relax and lose some of that judgment about their own emotions. So that's the first thing to say, that we can apply reappraisal to emotions themselves, the emotions we have about our emotional states. And I find that tremendously effective. And I know that this is something that's important for you as well.
I've thought a lot about that even for myself, as a kid who was pretty badly bullied. I had low self-esteem. I had a lot of fear, but I was also embarrassed as a kid that I was a kid who was a victim of bullying. And so, I'm dealing with, the loneliness and the fear and the shame, as well as, the embarrassment about I can't tell anybody about it. And a big part of our work, related to what you're saying, and I found this interesting when I go to schools, that do the work, that we're talking about, is when I share that story, and I'm pretty transparent these days about my experiences. And I ask students, like, have any of you ever felt that way before? It's almost like every kid is like, oh, thank goodness I can now be my true self. Because so many of us experience these feelings about our feelings that almost, sometimes have, even stronger negative consequences for us.
Some of those meta emotions or emotions about emotions that we have not only block us from kind of getting the help we need from other people, we also can even deny emotions that we're having to ourselves, right? So it's not just being so embarrassed we don't let other people know, but we can actually feel so anxious and embarrassed about what's going on that we don't even look at it directly ourselves. So we're simultaneously preventing others from helping because they don't know. And we're even compromising our own ability to kind of make good decisions because we're not able to kind of admit and focus on how awful this is and what steps we might take to change our situations or change our feelings. So I think the example you gave is so powerful because as a very highly esteemed, scientist who's sharing your wisdom with all of these students in the context of the work you do, wow, if this person who I so esteem can have this be true, that's okay if I also admit to it. And then all of a sudden they see everybody in the room saying, yeah, I can relate to that. And it may be different things for different people, of course. But, whatever it is, there's a lot of, I think, emotion about our emotional lives because we have these expectations for what we should be feeling. And if we don't feel that, it feels like we're doing something wrong. And then we get kind of tangled up in that. So that's the one version of applying reappraisal in a really practical way, which is to kind of normalize and validate. And that takes care of that second level emotion about emotion. But I think a second way to apply it is more concretely to the first level emotion. So when they are focused on, let's say social stressors, and there are many other stressors that you've mentioned, but one big stressor for people in middle school and of course high school is fitting in socially and sort of feeling connected with other people and feeling liked. That's just a tremendously important developmental task of that period. And if things aren't going well at a given point, that can feel like the end of the world. It can feel like this is never going to get better. And I think really just helping students, again, there's normalization. That's the first step. But then the second step is to have them appreciate, when they think nothing is working for me socially. And we do this in cognitive behavioral therapy. We sort of help them see that thought is an exaggeration so that they're representing this as the end of the world. This could not be worse. And then on further investigation, when you talk with them, they remember that actually they do have some friends. This is just this person who's being really mean to them right now. Have they always been mean? No, they haven't always been mean. Okay, so you're beginning to narrow down the kind of awfulness of the emotion at that first level, not invalidating it, but just locating it in this pattern of many other things that are going well. So that'd be an example, a starting point that would be a more therapeutic context where you can have a longer conversation. Other interventions we've done are scalable, brief, Qualtrics-driven interventions for high school students. And those have a different flavor because you're not able to really climb into that specific person's world and better understand it as you would in therapy. Here, you're just trying to adjust belief and mindsets about what it means when something's going wrong socially or academically. So Mark, those are the two kinds of levels of application I guess I see, and it's all very practical. I mean, and people get it. When you say, hey, thinking matters, and you give them some concrete examples, we often, and I know you do this too, give them an experience of conjuring a recent event that was really upsetting. Now you say, let's see if we can change some of the ways you think about it. How does that make you feel now that you're thinking about it this way? They're like, wow, I actually feel better. And you're like, yes, that is the experience of harnessing the power of reappraisal or rethinking.
So I want to get really concrete because I love where we're going. is, so they're presenting the rumination, the worry, the concern. We're letting people know that you can shift your thinking about that, as a parent or as a teacher or as a partner. What are some ways, what are the questions that you might ask yourself to help you get into that reappraisal? Or what are the questions that you might ask someone to help them engage in the process?
Yeah. So Mark, that's a great question. So I think the first step, which we've already taken, is to just realize how important it is to understand how we're thinking or someone else is thinking about a situation. Because sometimes we slip right by that and try to fix a situation, and that's fine. But many situations can't be fixed, or very difficult to fix. So I think just appreciating that there is this layer of thinking or appraising between the world and our emotions. That's huge. And if you can get everybody on board with the idea that thinking matters, that's a huge first step, and that's a big win. I think once you're on board with having some vocabulary around this importance of thinking, we then are in the land of trying to, at whatever level is appropriate for whoever it is that we're talking to, give them some version of what you and I've been talking about, which is this idea that there are specific things we can think that lead to certain specific emotions. And so if we can change our thinking, that can actually change our emotions. And so we want to have some more clarity about, are our emotions helpful right now or not helpful? And I think some people feel as soon as they have a negative emotion, they need to run away or change it. And I think that's worth challenging, because I think some negative emotions are telling us something really important. And instead of quickly trying to change it, we want to dive in and better understand what that emotion is telling us about the situation and about our goals in the moment. So I think in addition to this idea that thinking is important, I would also help people try to think about whether their emotion is something they do or don't want to change, and whether there's value in it, even if it feels negative. Because I think we too often think, as you said earlier in our conversation, that if it's negative, it's bad. It just seems like, yeah, if it's a negative emotion, it's bad, right? By definition. But I think we're using negative when we talk about negative emotion in a kind of different sense. And I think you and I might both want to say, wait, there's some emotions that we call, quote, negative, that actually are very helpful, very helpful.
So going into the questioning, so here I am, I'm sitting in bed, I'm ruminating, I'm worrying about something. How do I, what can I ask myself, or how can I shift my thinking? What are the ways I can be? How can I engage in the process?
Yeah. And again, first thing we've done is to say understand that thinking matters. We're past that point. Second point is this emotional state that's getting generated helpful or unhelpful? We're past that point. You're saying, yeah, okay, I got the thinking part and know this is not a helpful emotion. I want to change it. We still have a forking path there, because we want to say, is this the kind of thing that I can do myself, or am I going to need some help from somebody else? Now, if we're in a world where we think, okay, there's some things I can do to help myself, we're not always in that world. But if we are in that world, then the kinds of things I would want to be thinking about are, well, what is it that I am thinking about the situation? So that's my representation of the world as I think it is. What is it that I'm thinking must be true? And really kind of get clear on that. And it's easier done with another person, but sort of maybe challenge some of those thoughts about how your whole social world is falling apart, or your work life is completely a disaster, or you'll never graduate from high school or college because X, Y, and Z. And we sort of catastrophize. We make things worse in our mind than they probably really are. And what's difficult is that often happens when we're emotional. So we begin to get emotional, and then our thinking starts to get more extreme, and then we get more emotional, and off we go to the rumination races. And I think you're saying, how do we break that cycle? And I think jumping in and really challenging some of these representations of the way the world is, again, most easily done when there's another person, a therapist or a loved one or some trusted friend. But I think we can do this a little bit for ourselves. The other thing to target, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, is not just representing the way the world is, but how is it I want to be with this world? What are the goals that I have? And both of those, I think, are points of entry, concrete points of entry, so that we might say, well, it's not as bad as I think. And this is going to be a really good opportunity for me to use my social muscles or build some of my skills around interacting with this person. And so like, oh, okay, well, it's not all bad because it's not as bad as I thought. And there's some cool things that I can actually learn and grow through. And so all of a sudden it's like, whoa, okay, I'm kind of feeling more energized. I don't need to go backwards in rumination and cycle back and back over how horrible this is. I have some sort of paths forward. Again, we sometimes need help with this, right? So sometimes we just get looping and we get digging ourselves deeper and deeper in this hole. And it takes somebody else to help us out of that hole. And what's weird about this, but this is human nature, is that even that person who themselves is constantly ruminating and getting in big holes themselves, somehow when they look at you, they're like, hey, hang on, Mark, seriously, it's not as bad. Really, it's not as bad as you think. There's a lot of good here. Let's look for some opportunities. And then what's nice about that is they can do that for you. And then when they get burrowing down into rumination land, you're like all of a sudden the wise person. You're like, hey, hang on, friend. Here's some things I'm able to see. And that's just the asymmetry of position, right? So it's, if I'm standing inside myself and in an emotional turmoil, then I'm not going to be as clear as if I'm looking at your emotional turmoil and vice versa. So that's why the social dimension, of course, is so crucial.
I've always thought of it as a creative process, like where it's like an exercise in divergent thinking. And, recently I had to give a talk in a location where I was told in advance that I would not be well received. And so I got on the plane, like, why am I doing this? Like, am I like a self-saboteur? And then of course I'm like in my hotel room thinking to myself, like, why are you here? This is a waste of your time. And then I'm walking down in the morning, I have breakfast, and I'm thinking like, oh gosh, I can't believe I have to do this. And I started catching my negative self-talk. And then I said, well, it was basically, there was 150 superintendents of schools, which is representing a lot of kids, and like school board members from the entire state. And then I just sat there and I said to myself, but Mark, like, if you get this right, like this is an opportunity to like potentially impact the lives of like millions of kids in this particular state. And so, it was just amazing to me how I was able to like pause. I was by myself and and I'm knowledgeable of this. And I just forced myself, like, you got to think about this another way. You don't want to get up on that stage, in that mood state. And actually, like, it was completely, talking about like catastrophizing. There was not one negative comment. Everybody enjoyed the presentation, and so I was also making a lot of the story up based on things that I had heard, as opposed to, knowing what the reality was going to be.
Yeah, I think there are two beautiful things about that story, Mark. Thanks so much for sharing it. One beautiful thing about it is that even one of the world's experts on emotional intelligence still has, on occasion, these negative thought spirals and so forth. So that's like so important for people to appreciate, that even someone who lives in this space, expert, writing books, giving hundreds of talks, yeah, we're human too, right? So we also have some of these things, challenges around our emotions. So that's a beautiful thing, I think, to just showcase. The other thing I think that's important is that part of what the expertise does, and part of what sort of, and I fundamentally believe that everyone can get more expert than they were yesterday about understanding their emotions, finding ways to creatively manage or regulate them. And I think what's nice is to see in that example, second beautiful thing is just to see what that expertise looks like. So it's not that there's no emotion or even no negative emotion or unhelpful emotion. It's that you're able in near real time to spot the emotion, see that it's not going to be helpful, and then to have this creative sort of way of rethinking so that you're able to deliver in the way, show up in the way that you want to be for the presentation. And I just think that's really heartening. Just we're all in this together, and building expertise is so valuable, because if you can make even a bit of progress in real time, instead of screwing something up or yelling at somebody or hurting somebody inadvertently, you can intercept that and rework it. And that's just a beautiful demonstration.
I appreciate that. And as you were kind of saying that, I was thinking to myself, how many people, have not achieved their goals and dreams in life, because of the rumination that drives the behavior. And if we could only get people to learn these strategies, how different many people's lives would be. And that leads to my next question, James, which is, so I've been a little bit, going back to my negativity, and I'm going to ask you to help me reappraise here. Recently I was interviewed for an article that's coming out around, like, it's been 35 years since emotional intelligence, was coined, and, there's all this research, but the world looks like it's getting worse, and I've, in my own book writing right now, I've looked at all the articles on emotion regulation, and, like, obviously, this better than I, the last 20 years, it's like skyrocketed, but yet so has anxiety disorders and depression and all the fears that people are having, et cetera. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around, positive psychology, emotional intelligence, social emotional learning. Everybody's talking about it, but yet it looks, objectively speaking, like people are worse off psychologically than they've been before.
Yeah, well, great. I think that's a tough issue, and I share your concern, right? So how is it the case that we're making some progress, publishing lots of papers, certainly now 30,000+ papers every year on emotion regulation? How is that happening? And yet people are still suffering. In fact, not just still suffering, but the suffering seems to be increasing. How do we square that? And here's my take. First of all, I think people don't come into the world with a deep understanding of their emotions and what can be done to regulate their emotions. It's just not it's not like a handbook that comes out, as you're born. And I think we rely heavily on the people around us to share kind of thoughts and perspectives and ways of engaging in emotions. We look to our caregivers to model certain types of emotional responses. And so I think there's a huge lag between growing cultural awareness on the one hand and these, sort of indicators of suffering on the other, meaning that even if we were able to push that button so that all superintendents everywhere heard you talk, and they not only heard you talk, but they then implemented Ruler or some other program, and they got everyone going on some of these cool things that are out there. Even if that happened like right now, it would still take the world quite a while to catch up. And it is true, I guess, that, some of the first work on emotional intelligence was done decades ago at this point. But that was early work. That was pioneering work, popularized obviously in places. But this is work that's only now growing, I think, in the way that, really is going to get out there to people. And I think with your work and my work and others' work, it's only in the past little bit of time in world historical terms, past decade or so, maybe a bit more, that really there's been this concerted effort to translate these basic insights we're developing into practical kind of, how do I handle this kind of information that you've, helped me with in this conversation? So how do we do that translation? And I just think it's only been in the past decade or so that we've been doing this concerted effort to get information out there. And I think as people learn about this, that doesn't automatically mean that their suffering goes away. It just means that the suffering will be diminished over time. And I profoundly believe that if and as we get this information into people's hands at earlier and earlier ages, they will be better equipped not to never have negative emotions. That's an unrealistic goal, but to be able to manage those emotions in ways that mean they don't get derailed in life by breaking an important relationship or failing out of school or taking irreversible steps that might damage their own and others' lives. So I handle this disconnect myself by thinking, look, this is a tough problem. We're trying to help people with some fundamental features of human nature. and they need information, and it needs to be actionable, and we need to get it to everybody. And that just takes a long time. And my hope is, and expectation is, that this is the way to eventually diminish suffering over time. So I'm looking forward. I get the challenge, but that's how I think about it.
And that's a reappraisal too, right? You're turning the problem into action, figure out ways to do these experiments that help people get those ideas out there. So I see a lot of hope in your response. So thank you for that. We've talked together, in our conversations, around the role of mindsets and where those mindsets about feelings come from. So I'm going to ask you now to go for our last little bit of time together, a little bit personal. And, one thing I don't know much about you is, your development, your childhood, your adolescence. And I'm just curious if I would ask you to just reflect a minute on your upbringing. And if you were to create a title for the movie that would describe what you learned about emotions and emotion regulation growing up in your household, what might you title that movie?
Sure. So I have two titles, both silly, but I think it's a great question. So, as you know, my last name is Gross, which is probably one of the least preferred names a child could have going through elementary to middle school. And so I was teased and prodded and poked, of course, in lots of ways. And so one title would be La Vie en Gros, right? So sort of this is the suffering through a life when you are misnamed Gross. The other is, another version of the title for my early life chapters would be something like From Chaos, Order. And the second of the two, I think, speaks to the fact that growing up, we had an unusual family constellation. I'm the eldest of six, and my youngest four siblings were adopted as, quote, hard to place. And what that meant, and that's terminology that's used by social service agencies, is that these are kids who would not have likely been adopted by anybody because of their ethnicity or because of their experiences early in life. And so four of the six of us were adopted early on, very different ethnicities and backgrounds and life experiences to that point. And we together kind of were cobbled into a family that was perhaps a little more chaotic than my brain would have loved to have ideally. And so I was then, as someone who likes to think and likes to have ideas and likes to read philosophy, in the midst of a fairly chaotic situation growing up. And so for me, I think that formed the basis of my interest in how do we think about the intersection of reason and the passions. And when there's a lot of emotion going around, what's helpful, what's not helpful. And when it's not helpful, what can we do about it? So I think that's sort of the personal basis, maybe, of some of my interest in the field.
And to just go a little bit deeper, as you know, I write about this concept, which I call permission to feel. And in my research, I have found that, many people say they had some people in their childhood with whom they could be their true selves, who was like a feelings mentor, but even more people say they didn't have it. And I was just curious, growing up, did you have a feelings mentor? Was there someone who you just felt like, wow, I can be my true self with this person. I can confide, talk about my feelings with that person?
It would be my mom, who was very, I think, in tune with her emotions, and emotions were very much part of kind of the way she engaged the world. And so she valorized the notion that one would take seriously emotions and emotional responses.
I know we don't have much time left, and I want to respect that, but I do have to ask you just two quick questions. The first is, you want to be in that yellow quadrant on our mood meter. What's your go-to strategy for bringing yourself some joy and happiness and excitement?
Being around people I love and talking to them about interesting things. That's my go-to.
And you want to be calm, content, tranquil, peaceful, relaxed. What's your go-to strategy to help you get there?
I then am by myself thinking about cool thoughts and so forth. So the way I toggle, I love thinking about cool thoughts, and it's just going to be a matter of with other people or on my own.
Cool. Final question. Imagine a world where everyone learns about emotion regulation and applies all the things that you and others have developed and studied. What do you see?
Yes, please, is what I see. I would love to be in that world, Mark, working as hard as I can to kind of get us a little closer. I see a world in which there are real connections between people. There's upset and there are difficult moments, but those difficult moments don't derail people or relationships. So people are able to pursue valued goals in a lot of love, being their true selves, and channeling their real passions into changes in the world that kind of meet their needs. And there's just a lot less barriers and a lot less spinning wheels and a lot less, digging yourself into ditches. So that's the world that I see, and I can't wait to get to.
I can't wait to be there with you. I know we're going to wrap, and I want to just make sure that people have access to your knowledge and your research. Can you give us some information about how people can learn more about you?
So just Google James Gross, and you'll see my website, our papers, all our projects.
Awesome. Well, James, I can't thank you enough. Found this really informative, and I'm always in learning mode, and now I feel like I'm in processing mode because this helped to deepen my understanding of your work and you.
Thanks, Mark. It was a pleasure. I love our conversations. Appreciate the opportunity.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. James Gross. My big take-home message was, you can change how you feel by changing how you think. And that's reappraisal. Again, we have the power to change how we feel by changing how we think. Please let me know down below in the comments your thoughts about this episode. I'm particularly interested in hearing the ways that you used reappraisal, repurposing, Reconstrual, in dealing with your own feelings. And if you enjoyed today's episode, I want to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, share episodes with your friends and family, and follow me on social media for additional tips. Really glad to have you on this Dealing with Feelings journey with me, and I hope to see you next time.